Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Arun Ramanathan. I am the CEO of Pivot Learning and the chairman of the board of the Consortium on Reaching Excellence in Education, CORE. And it's my privilege today to bring you our webinar, Instructional Leadership and Excellence in Special Education. So we've got a wonderful agenda for you today. We're going to talk about the need for instructional leadership, how you assess instructional leadership, how you develop instructional leadership, and we're going to talk about solutions there for both special education leaders and for special education teachers and related service providers. And then we're going to have hopefully about 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. And there is a Q&A feature on the webinar, the Zoom webinar. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to type in your questions during the course of the webinar. And then at the end, we will be going through the questions one by one, and the panel will do their best to answer them. So let's take a look at our wonderful panel. We have an amazing group here of special education and instructional experts. I'm the CEO, as I noted, of Pivot Learning. Also, I have a background, about 20 years in special ed, including leading the special education system and student services in the San Diego Unified School District. We have Connie Jensen, who's former Assistant Superintendent of Student Support Services in Long Beach Unified. Parasima Shahidi, who is the former Director of Special Education in Long Beach Unified. Terry Peterson, Dr. Terry Peterson, former Director of Educational Services in the Saddleback Valley Unified School District. And Dean Ballard, the Director of Mathematics at CORE. Each of our panelists will be taking a separate section of the webinar today. So let's take a look at our learning objectives. Again, we kind of previewed this right at the beginning, but we're going to take some time to understand why instructional leadership is the key to improving outcomes for students with disabilities. This webinar, by the way, couldn't be happening on a better day to talk about this after the release of the CASP results yesterday, which showed how much we need to shift the focus from compliance to instructional leadership and instructional support in special education based on the dismal results for students with disabilities. You're going to learn how we at Pivot and CORE assess your system, because we know that one level of change happens at the systems level, and develop an action plan for improving special education outcomes in reading and math and other subject matter areas. And then we're going to find out from our experts how to build the capacity of special educators, both from the classroom side, the related services side, and the leadership side, to become instructional leaders, the instructional leaders we need them to be in order to change the system and the outcomes of that system. So I'm going to briefly cover the need for instructional leadership. Again, the results yesterday couldn't have made it clearer to anybody. But let's take a look at what those results were. We've made this slide before they came out yesterday, but essentially they're the same. Nothing really changed all that much yesterday when the CASP results came out. 14% meeting or exceeding standards in English language arts, and only 11% in mathematics. That is by far one of the lowest percentages for any subgroup in our state. And it is not a surprise, therefore, next slide please, that 163 California districts were identified for meeting the criteria for assistance based on the performance of students with disabilities. In fact, I would expect that number to go up substantially based on the results yesterday, or the lack of results yesterday. So, and not only is that an issue that our state is looking at, but it is very clear, and we know that special education is an area that can be highly legal, but this is a legal obligation for us to improve outcomes for kids with disabilities. So it's a moral obligation. It's one we all care about, but it is also a legal obligation now. And that ante has been upped last year by the Andrew decision, which has held now that schools must offer students an IEP that is reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of a child's circumstances. And that is a very different definition of a free and appropriate education. We can no longer provide the minimal education that a child should be receiving in order to receive a benefit. We have to be providing a maximum, the maximum necessary in order for that child to succeed in both school and in college and career, whatever their circumstances lead them to, setting those high expectations on our end. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it over to Connie, and she's going to take you through what we do in order to assess instructional leadership in the special education system. Connie, you're muted.
Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, Arun. In the next 3 sections, we're going to describe to you our process for assessing and supporting instructional leadership in the special education system. And you all know how important that is to our students. We're currently working with multiple districts that have very similar concerns to the ones that Arun raised and described to you earlier, which include low subgroup scores, frequent referrals for special education, and in many cases, multiple students placed in a non-public setting rather than in their public school setting. So we are looking to the process that we use, and what we start out with generally first is to interview multiple staff members from both special and general education and ask them about their challenges, their successes, and what they perceive as their next steps or what they think might work for them. Following that kind of interview, we gather all that data together and hold it to the side, and then we administer a formalized needs assessment. And the needs assessment is divided into 5 categories or 5 dimensions. The first one is about vision, and it's about everyone knowing what the vision and understanding what the vision for special education improvement is about within the district. Does everyone know and understand it? Is the vision clear? And the next one is asking how assessment is used to evaluate and to drive informed decision-making within every district. What assessments do you use? How do you know that those are meeting the needs or needs are being met within the district for students? The third one is about the curriculum and instruction. What is being taught and how it's being taught. And we want to make sure that we can guide strong professional learning in that area. So we look at that carefully. We also look at culture and capacity and sustainability. In other words, is the district prepared for growth? And are they committed to a sustainable system that they're going to implement and keep around for a while based on the fact that we're using assessment to inform the decisions we make within that system? And to check to see if they have any coherent practices or structures in place which already are on the road to improving teaching and learning. And if they're there, we want to make sure that we use those and sustain those as well. Okay, so the next thing that we look at is the trying to determine the landscape for the district and also to spend time looking for the root cause. So we've got to identify and define. This takes some time to do that, identify and defining of the strengths, the challenges, and the actual problem that may exist. Let's take, for example, frequently on the needs assessment, curriculum and instruction comes up as a problem. So that means we have to define it very clearly. We have to gain further information and understanding about it. So we have to talk about it deeply, look to see what practices have been in place and whether they're working or not. And then begin to determine causal relationships. What's happening if we do this? What's happening if we do that? And we're going to highlight priority solutions with potential for the greatest impact. So this is where some deep thinking from everyone comes around, and their input is extremely important to make these determinations. And then how does this guide us? Well, let's say, for instance, we go back to that section where we know that curriculum and instruction was a great need for a particular district. So we create a theory of action. And the theory of action is an if-then statement. If we do this, then this might happen. But it's also something that we use to facilitate and create an action plan. So we can determine a clear path for implementation and follow it and monitor as we go on. So an example of that kind of theory of action in regards to curriculum and instruction would be if we support an increase in the effectiveness of instruction to meet the needs of all special education students, then we'll see an increase in student learning and achievement. Makes total sense, doesn't it? So we have to think like that. And that's what we'll be working on. And then lastly, in this particular section, we're going to talk about the action plan that's developed as a result of that theory of action. So if you go down to the bottom right-hand corner, you'll notice the cycle for that action plan. What we do is create a plan, which is like a roadmap for our implementation. We make sure that we schedule progress monitoring throughout that entire cycle. That's something we never lose sight of. And we study the results. So we plan it, we do it, we study the results, and we look at specific data points to make sure that we're analyzing the data correctly and measuring the effectiveness. Because if it's not effective, we have to take action. If it is effective, we take a different kind of action. So let's say if the plan is working and effective, we continue the work. If the plan is not working and we see from the data that progress is limited, then we're going to need to revisit the plan and alter it or adjust it accordingly. Okay, and I think now Dr. Shahidi is going to speak to you about a specific district we've been working with and provide some solutions for special ed leaders.
Thank you so much, and good morning, everybody. For the past 5 months, 4 of us Pivot coaches have been working with this district. Following the Pivot approach, we started by looking at data, reviewing records, and meeting with different groups of stakeholders. In addition, we observed many schools and classes in order to come up with the root cause for a high number of special education referrals and high number of non-public school placements. We found lack of effective differentiated first instruction to be the root cause. Many districts have this problem, but what is unique about this district is the degree to which they're experiencing this problem. General education teachers quickly give up when faced with challenging students and want them placed in special education. And special education teachers faced with challenging students jump to wanting them in non-public school settings. The special education director has become a partner with us. The other day, next slide please, the other day she was sharing the fact that she was getting pushback from her special education teachers who do not see themselves as needing to focus on instruction. We spent some time talking about the root cause of that pushback and came up with the root cause being segregation of special education students. You see, segregation has a ripple effect. Years ago, when we segregated special education students, little did we know that we were also segregating special education teachers and special education leaders. At that time, the teacher education programs that were set up mainly concentrated on disabilities, impact of such disabilities, how to assess, how to observe, behavior mod, and other good teachings. However, they did not focus on instruction. And when they covered accommodations and modifications, those skills did not rest on solid teaching. It was an add-on. To make matters worse, in this district, they have the challenge of starting the year with many, I thought I heard 40, but I'm not sure, many interns. These interns know very little about special ed, IEPs, or teaching in general. A few have already talked about dropping out or quitting. We were told that the programs they're in will not address this problem anytime soon. In fact, they may not have to take classes for a year. This is what we were told. It needs to be verified. Those who are staying have to be taught how to teach. So who teaches them? If the programs are not doing that, who teaches them? That leaves the principals and the special education leaders. Now, we know generically throughout the nation, not all special education leaders are instructional leaders. And those leaders are typically not at the table when the district is making major decisions. In this district, many on the special ed leadership team have taught in the past, but for many years now, they've mainly focused on putting out fires. In addition, There are those who were speech therapists, behaviorists, or psychologists who have never taught at all. So you see the challenge we have before us. The general education teachers serving special education students have told us that they lack knowledge about disabilities, and they're concerned about the time it takes out of their day to prepare and serve special needs students. So they have a big job ahead of them. But if the belief is there that all students are at risk and deserve a tiered system of interventions that meets their needs, then things will be much better. If this is not happening, then special education becomes the intervention. And this is where we're at with this district right now. Our solutions. We're going to address special education and general education systems simultaneously. Our special ed director, I told you she's our partner, has been successful in setting up a pilot of 7 schools whose leaders are excited about the Gen Ed special ed collaboration. In fact, we had a meeting with them, joint meeting last week, and one of the principals walked in yelling, finally, we're collaborating with special ed. We will also work on increasing the network of relationships between special ed and other departments. For example, the MTSS department that has been recently set up doesn't collaborate with special ed. In fact, it is that department is becoming as isolated as special ed. Wouldn't it be great if they worked together? We're supporting the district in clarifying their priority for differentiated, effective first instruction for all teachers. We are training special education leaders to become instructional coaches. They are learning about effective differentiated first instruction, as well as how to coach and the best ways to provide feedback. Later this month, could you go to the next slide, please? Later this month, we are starting instructional rounds at the 7 schools in the pilot. These rounds are organized around a focused question or a goal that the site leadership will select, and it will include general education and special ed if the goal asks for it. The data that will be collected will not include information about a specific teacher or classroom. It will be goal-based. Each team, there's 4 of us, so we have 4 teams. Each team will focus on patterns and trends as the plan is reviewed for effectiveness, and then followed by feedback and coaching to address the areas of need. And as Connie mentioned, we're true believers in cycle of continuous improvement, so the plan, do, study, act will continue. Thank you so much for listening. Now I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Peterson for the second case study.
Thank you, Seema, and good morning, everyone. The story that I'm going to share is of a district who, like many others, was confronted with large academic achievement gaps among their advantaged and their disadvantaged students. So in this historical case study, you can see that they identified 3 priority needs. First, their moral imperative concerns led to the belief that their organization, first and foremost, needed to raise the bar and close the gap of learning for all students, regardless of the background. In addition, the district over time had a gradual but steady change in their demographics, and they were forced to challenge their current status quo. Once they were a district that had prided themselves on a high API under the hockey stick accountability measure of No Child Left Behind, but it suddenly found itself struggling with substantial disparities in AYP scores among their subgroups, with the gaps widening in special ed and English learner students. So these external accountability pressures, along with other factors, led to an over-identification as well as an over-representation of English learners and students of colors within their special education programs. So this district, like many others, were facing the same problems. And then their last priority need was that there was a stark realization and an actual acceptance by the district that their general education and their special education worked in silos. Everyone was working hard, but there was a need to find a way to collectively focus their efforts on deeper learning for all students. So what were some of the elements that they considered? Among the key elements that they first knew they had to consider was that of engaging all stakeholders. To get buy-in, they knew they needed to facilitate participation within all levels of their instructional leadership. Next, to further this culture of shared leadership, they had a need to create and implement a cohesive action plan. They had not done that, with system alignment that coordinated their practices and their structures, all focused on improved teaching and learning. So within this action plan, all stakeholders, it was decided, would receive coaching and professional development. And that coaching and PD was going to be focused on capacity building over compliance and would provide systematic support, as well as it needed to be targeted and sustainable. So another major consideration that they had was to conduct an in-depth analysis of both their internal and their external accountability measures. And when they did this, they found that methods to collect, measure, evaluate data consistently were not in place. So therefore, they couldn't use it to assess the effectiveness. And then last, as all teachers and administrators know, staffing and schedules can make or break any initiative. So consideration had to be given in how to best gain ongoing implementation support. So what were their priority solutions? First, they worked on a shift in mindset. So to prepare for such an organizational shift that went from the central office to the classroom, the district needed to develop the knowledge and expertise among all the stakeholders. They needed that foundational understanding to ground them in a common shared vision. With a cultural legacy as a high-performing district, though, it was difficult for many teachers and administrators to change what had felt comfortable and had been quite successful, frankly, for some of their most advantaged students. But with that came a fixed mindset. So wanting to level the playing field, the district worked to develop a constructive growth of mindsets, all centered around the key priorities that were identified in their needs assessment. And they discovered in creating and implementing their action plan, but they had been accustomed to focusing on sequential actions that kind of put everything in a set order, but they realized to have a shift in mindset, they also needed to embed in their plan holistic actions that established systems and structures that gave everyone a purpose and a value within their learning environments. So next came building relationships. As they worked at cultivating the expertise of everyone, they began to become very focused on a collective purpose, and they had deliberate actions. They understood why they were doing what they were doing. So as that happened, the district began to see a tipping point where they actually could use the group to change the group. By investing in this collective capacity building, they were able to develop both vertical and horizontal instructional leadership to bring about change at all levels. This constant effort for collaboration and communication ensured that everyone began to be on the same page. And slowly, not quickly, but slowly but surely, they moved in a shared direction. They fostered what they called communities practices. They could be called professional learning communities. But what was important was that they established relationships among and between teachers, principals, departments, and school sites. And so suddenly these relationships began to be supported and nurtured. And slowly the silos were opened and networking was embraced. What happened was over time teachers realized they could still have autonomy, but they could have that autonomy within a construct of interaction with one another, and they began to sort out what was effective and what was not effective. Following that came a precision in pedagogy. They knew they wanted to make powerful pedagogy for deep learning visible across the system. So what they did is they worked with Teachers Union to create a job description for an instructional coach position. Most of their coaches were hired from within the district's teacher ranking, and it provided teachers across the grade level and content areas with multiple opportunities to observe, to question, reflect, practice, shape, and adapt their instructional practices. Also, active participation by teachers in developing common assessments brought agreement, and they began to look at content, process, and product, and these common protocols were established district-wide. Over time, high-yield practices were identified and were deemed to be non-negotiables. They were used by both special education and general education teachers. Most of their professional development was done through trainer models. Then they also cultivated deep collaborative work. With a renewed focus on pedagogy, they grew to understand their role. They began to establish time for teacher collaboration. They looked at their instructional data, plan instructional grouping, and they found ways to provide for small grouping and direct instruction. In developing these steps, the district provided a clear path for implementing using what Connie described earlier as the theory of action as the driver. Instructional leaders were able to access multiple points in order to decision-make process of doing the plan, do, study, act. And by applying this cycle of continuous improvement, what this district found is that if you have a system with focus, lots of interaction, and transparency of data, you're bound to make progress. So next, to share how to build that capacity from a school and classroom focus, I'd like to introduce you to Dean Ballard.
Thank you. And I'm going to build on what Terry just shared to talk about building capacity in schools and districts, sharing some experiences from inside classrooms that emphasize the needs and the possibilities. Ongoing effective instruction is built on 3 interconnected cornerstones as shown on the diagram on the slide. Foundational knowledge, research-based instructional tools and resources, and job-embedded support. All teachers, whether we're talking about core, special education, or intervention classes, need foundational knowledge. Teachers need to know the content they're teaching, including connections to earlier knowledge and knowledge about this content. With knowledge, teachers need tools and resources to work with. Teachers should have research-based programs and assessment tools so they're not expected to teach, be experts, and be curriculum writers all at the same time. And they need training to understand the content, the pedagogy, and the implementation. This training and implementation support needs to be ongoing support that reaches into the classroom so teachers can see the ideas being implemented with their own students. Now, working with districts and schools and classrooms, we find special education teachers are often overwhelmed. They're managing paperwork, meetings, specialization in addressing behavioral needs and fulfilling academic needs at the same time. In their classrooms are often a wide range of needs academically for reading and for math. Teachers are challenged with being experts in all levels of math, all levels of reading instruction, and knowing how to adapt to individual needs in the room. And teachers are often underprepared. With one West Coast district we recently worked with in reading for the special education teachers, we found that teachers had little to no knowledge about teaching how to read, and many had a defeatist attitude about student ability and needs. Teachers needed to understand what good instruction in teaching reading looks like, and they needed to see their students could learn to read, and also why it was important for the students to learn to read. In another district we work with, I was recently in the special education classrooms and also met privately with the teachers to look at how to provide more effective math instruction. Students had been assigned an endless stream of worksheets with a single-minded focus on fact and procedural fluency. It wasn't so much that teachers believed their students couldn't do any thinking or that their students couldn't understand concepts, but rather it seemed the teachers didn't understand the math well enough themselves to do much more than adapt practice sheets and teach basic procedures. They just didn't feel confident themselves. When I spent some time in their classrooms modeling some fluency activities that also required some level of thinking and reasoning by students, and showed how to scaffold the activities to continually challenge students, both the teachers and the students were very enthusiastic. In fact, students were highly engaged in the math activities that required concept building and reasoning and practice for 40 to 45 minutes. Teachers just need knowledge and materials that provide access to math beyond facts and procedures. Sometimes we also find education teachers are overlooked. Often when we're called in to provide workshops for ELA and math, we have to ask that special education teachers be included. All too often, administrators and special education teachers themselves see the workshops as great ideas that apply to general ed students, but not so much to students with disabilities. And unfortunately, this reinforces and digs deeper the hole they're in. While it is true that adaptations and accommodations often need to be made for students with disabilities, the basics of learning to read and learning math are fundamentally the same for all students. Teachers teaching these topics need to learn these fundamentals. Special education teachers also often do need further help in how to adapt and scaffold context for their students' needs. However, we still need to remember that teachers need to understand the content in order to make effective scaffolds so that students with disabilities are being challenged at a level that's appropriate to their circumstances. There are some key elements to keep in mind relating to ELA and math instruction. Reading foundation skills are necessary, and it turns out that about 80% of reading difficulties stem from a phonological deficit. For those students who have a core phonological deficit, they need phonological and phonemic awareness development at the advanced level that goes beyond basic oral blending and segmenting activities. Examples of advanced phonemic awareness include phoneme manipulation activities such as phoneme deletion, substitution, and addition. Students also need systemic explicit phonics instruction that follows a research-based approach such as outlined in the Coteaching reading sourcebook. And they need massive amounts of connected text practice with decodable books and chapter books. In math, conceptual understanding, number sense, and fluency are keys to progress. Research identifies the biggest areas of need typically for students struggling with math are understanding and fluency related to operations with both whole numbers and rational numbers. These are the areas of greatest impact in relation to ongoing concepts developed K-12. Students with disabilities benefit from greater degrees of explicit instruction. That means smaller bites of concepts and procedures at one time, more guided practice, more worked examples, independent work with feedback, and fewer alternative methods. Like all students, high levels of engagement are important for success. Instruction must be balanced between conceptual learning and building procedural fluency. With this, students can and need to learn to reason and apply math. Special education should not prune math down to fact and procedural memorization. This is not an appropriate math education. In the long run, if a student doesn't also learn when, why, and how to use procedures, then what good will it do them to be good at those procedures? Finally, I also want to mention computer programs because they're so prevalent these days. One-to-one computers and tablets are both a promise, great resources, and unfortunately, it's been a pain to watch how often they're used just to babysit kids rather than instruct. We look for programs that have a balanced or a blended model with small group instruction. Students should typically not be spending more than 15 to 30 minutes on a computer at a time, and this is an ideal time for the teacher to meet with students individually or in small groups. So with materials, knowledge, and support, special education teachers can provide instruction that challenges all students at appropriate levels, and kids will respond. Learning to read and learning math concepts and skills are just as important for students with disabilities as all other students. So with that, I thank you, and now let me turn this back over to Arun.
Thank you, Dean. And so I want to appreciate all of our amazing panelists and the information that they provided. We will be providing the PowerPoint itself to any participant who asks, and we'll also have it loaded up on our website, and we'll send a link out to folks to a place where they can access it. So let's talk back again really quickly, just in good practice, review our learning objectives. Again, we've had a great group of panelists talk about why instructional leadership is key to improving the outcomes. We've talked about assessing the system. We have to assess the system. We have to understand that flow from central office down to the school and classroom level, and then that process back from the classroom level up to the central office, how that system works. Is it working to improve instructional effectiveness, or is it actually serving as a barrier to improving instructional effectiveness? And then developing a plan to get to the other side of the problems and the root causes that we identify. That's the approach. And then look, how do you actually build the capacity of educators? And part of those, we got to think about principals and special education leaders as educators and building their capacity, understanding how you go about that process of bringing these often disparate and isolated cultures together but then building the capacity of special education teachers and related service providers and general education teachers, and then directly addressing pedagogy and then some of the barriers that prevent folks. And it's not their fault typically, it's that we just haven't provided them the support and understanding and professional development, even in areas as simple as providing them the same training and curriculum the general ed teachers get. Those are the areas that we've seen in so many places and that we're talking about in the course of this webinar. So that's the last learning objective. And now we're going to shift to Q&A.
Okay, so thank you for submitting such great questions, everyone. We're going to have time for about 10 to 15 minutes worth of Q&A with our panelists, and we're going to follow up with an FAQ sheet to answer the questions that we don't have time for, any additional questions that you have. So to kick things off, our first question to the panel is going to be, I'm in a system where gen ed and special ed don't collaborate. What can we do about it?
Ariel, excuse me, I'd like to talk about that for a moment, because what I've heard in the last 20 or 25 minutes is so relevant to this question. When I hear people talking about silos and special ed working separately from general ed, if district goals are, or if the district's main goal is that all students will learn, that means all. All means all. So that means all teachers need the same training. So that means that all special ed teachers and all general education teachers need the same training. But I think the true answer to how you get them to collaborate and learn from one another is to allow them to work around the actual work of teaching and learning. So providing opportunities for special education teachers and general education teachers to join together, discuss student work, discuss student strategies that do work or solve problems is a great way to develop collaboration. You can't force a friendship, but you can certainly learn to work together around the work.
And if I might, Ariel, add to that, I think it's really important to address the culture, that fixed mindset of teachers working in isolation and silos. Coordinated, coherent practices and structures can only happen if you have collaboration and systems alignment. And in most cases, I think to do this, the status quo must be challenged by sort of pushing the transparency of gen ed and special ed programs, policies, and practices.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, panelists. We're going to continue the questions here. So our next question is, how do I go on making a strong case for needing to have a one-to-one aid so that my daughter will have her AAC, PODD be used throughout the day?
Well, the aid question is a really good one, because we get that as educators almost every day we are at work. We have to see what the goal is. What is the goal? Instead of the goal being to get an aid, what is the goal for your child, for your student? What are you trying to accomplish, and what is the best way to get there? So the shift should be from having a body to getting to the goal of having your child have access to the curriculum.
So I've got another question here I'm going to ask. This is about the PDSA cycles. The first is, how long do they typically last? And then how do you aggregate the data and use the data?
Well, I think I can go back to that question. PDSA never stops. It's a continual cycle of improvement. So it's not like you do it once and walk away. It's like it's a continuous cycle, and you have indicated areas where you're going to be checking in on progress monitoring, so you're going to have data to look at. It's any time you want to check in and see where you're going. You can't just launch the plan and do everything that you indicated there without checking to see if it's working or not. So I think the answer to that is those are ongoing cycles. They do not stop, and there isn't a starting or an ending point in particular. And the second part of the question, Arun, can you say that again?
It's around how do you aggregate and pull together the data that you're getting?
I think if in writing that plan, you actually name the data points that you're going to collect, and you're aware of those, and everyone is aware of those, then you are leading to the place where everybody is going to have some data to bring to the table, sit down and look at and analyze and come up with a solution to a problem if there is one, or say, wow, whatever we're doing right now is working really well. Let's continue with that, or let's develop it further.
And I might add that the more you get used to doing those cycles and they kind of become organic, it takes away some of that fear that teachers previously had of sharing data and thinking that any kind of underperformance would be viewed with blame. So in doing these cycles, it actually provides transparency, and you just sort of go through them, be it on a common informal assessment tool or a benchmark, and it allows you to sort of shape and reshape your instruction as you go. But most importantly, I think these cycles allow you to grow your ability to make good decisions based on professional development and judgment.
And going back to the very first question too, here's another place where relationships are developed and trust is developed among staff members, whether it's general ed teachers and special ed teachers together, or just a mixture of both. It's a place where you can have those discussions and relationships are built.
So next question, another great question following these last two. I'm in a district that does collaborate and focuses on special ed CNI, and this is year 3, and my special ed teachers are still resistant and most have a fixed mindset. Any advice moving forward? We've done mindfulness and mindset training.
I think high expectations, not giving that up. Inviting them, as we were talking earlier, inviting them and making sure they're at the trainings. I believe some of the pushback comes from fear. Fear of what do I do? I'm not sure of my teaching ability. I'm not sure how this pertains to this group of students. So once they become leaders themselves in instruction, that goes away, I find.
I think too that maintaining the data collection helps with that. So because we all know that probably one of the greatest motivators in the world is getting some results. So if teachers are trying something, even though it's secret and they don't want anybody else to know they're doing it, and they're getting some results from it, they're going to be very happy about it and they're going to want to continue on. So figuring out ways to encourage and make those opportunities available for people to get results is very important.
And it goes hand in hand with behavior mod or behavior control of the classroom, motivation of the students. You can't do it in isolation. The 40 interns I was telling you about, the program specialists we're talking about, here's another year of just controlling the kids in the classroom. So if you have that mindset, you have a whole year of nothing happening instructionally. So you have to do it hand in hand. You can't do one. And I find that a lot of the special ed teachers are either fearful of the instruction part that we talked about, or they really don't have control over the students in their classrooms. Mm-hmm. So it has to be hand in hand. You can't just do one.
Okay. The next question is, the California Department of Education recognizes that dyslexia exists in 15 to 20% of the California student population. And these bright kids require teachers professionally trained to provide evidence-based instruction. Gen ed and special ed teachers are highly qualified to provide structured literacy instruction. How does a district ensure that an adequate number of gen ed and special ed teachers are highly qualified to provide structured literacy instruction in the earliest years and throughout the K-12 student career?
I'm not sure I got that ending.
So the question's really around dyslexia and the need for supporting teachers with improving their pedagogy on the gen ed and special ed side. How do you approach that improvement, particularly in the earliest years of the student's career?
I think if you take a look at what we were talking about, that all students are at risk. All students are at risk and deserve a tiered system of interventions. Having the dialogue early on is critical. As soon as the kids get in school, instead of thinking about placement in special ed, talking about what the kids need in order to succeed. We have a lot of people with a lot of knowledge in the area of dyslexia, learning disabilities, phonemic awareness. We have all of that. It's just understanding that as soon as we know there is a problem, jump to get resolution as far as what you need to teach in order for the child to be successful. A lot of times we wait for the child to fail so that we can place them in a program, and that is not acceptable.
I want to add there too that Dean had to drop off from our collaborator core, and we do a tremendous amount of work with both gen ed and special education teachers through our teaching reading academies and our work on addressing dyslexia, on building foundational skills and building the skills of teachers to both see the need when students are having challenges that may be evidence of dyslexia or another learning disability, and then pedagogically, what are the types of skills that you need to develop in order to address those needs. Often that hasn't been a focus inside some of the districts that we support, but it's increasingly, and I think your reference to the California Department of Education is a great one. Increasingly, districts are becoming more and more aware of this need, and as a result, more and more of this type of work is happening, not just in California, but also nationally. The last piece I would add is that it's also becoming an increasing awareness of parents, and here's another area where the Andrew decision is going to clearly apply in coming years. Okay, so next question. So how do you typically offer a district around support around systems change? What is that? Can you talk a little bit about what that means? And just describing it a little bit more, maybe going back into some of the earlier commentary. The question was just basically like how do you support systems change inside a district?
Right. I think it all hinges and goes back to a needs assessment and really taking a deep, honest, hard look at what's happening in the district and making determinations about where you need to go in the way of improvement. What do you need to fix? What do you need to work on to make better? It's a constant cycle. And, you can build the best plan in the world, but until you have it down, so you actually are gathering data around something in particular, measuring it and determining effectiveness, it's really difficult to do. So I think it goes back to that very first discussion we had.
We have several questions here on one aspect of systems change, which is improving inclusion. And the question is often around specific students and desire of parents. Inclusion is one element that's of systems change. And all of you I know have worked on building more inclusive systems. Could you each talk a little bit about what it takes to build an inclusive system, and then what parents should do if they're seeking more inclusive opportunities for their students, for their children?
I love inclusion. We've seen fantastic results when it comes to inclusion of special needs students, but if it's not done correctly, it's going to be horrendous. One of the things we learned is that there's got to be a plan. Typically, we talk about placing a child here and there. We're talking about placement. We have to take a look at what services we're providing. How are we going to change the system in the classroom? UDL strategies, differentiation that the gen ed teacher is going to apply, something that is easy and he or she can implement easily in the classroom with some guidance. We have found that there's got to be planning for that inclusion, a lot of thought, so the child should not go from the IEP to, okay, now you're fully included, and now the teacher is asking, what do I do? Which was one of the cases I was bringing up in my talk. there was no planning in those cases. So there's got to be planning as to what does the child need, how much differentiation is needed, who's going to provide what kind of support the teacher needs. And, you know, a lot of times teachers need information on the disability. If the disability is unique, they need information about that. And sometimes the students and the aides in the classroom need the same. The students can also be very helpful in helping each other.
And I would like to just add to that, that you really have to start with a total systems overview, because as I had shared earlier, we all know that what can make or break any reform movement is getting caught in the weeds of schedules and how we staff and how we create these structures or time blocks. So I think first and foremost, you really have to start making sure that those silos between gen ed and special ed, between the school site and the district, all have the time to plan in advance. So you deal with the teachers at a site level who say, well, wait a minute, you know, I already have 32 kids in my class, so they're concerned with how that's going to look. Or I don't teach language arts at that time, so you know, I can't include students at that time. Or you might have the district SPED department calling you and saying, wait a minute, the way the IEP is written, you know, you have to rework that. So the important thing about inclusion is making sure that there's a systems alignment and that adequate time is given at all levels so that everybody has a level of competence and understanding of how that's going to take place, and that the focus is always on what are the needs of the students, and then you back into, okay, how do we make our schedules and our staffing and our systems support that, the needs of that student.
I want to go back to that understanding piece too, Terry, and I think it's really important for teachers who are going to include students in their classroom to understand what it is and what it looks like, what it sounds like, and what it feels like. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes they don't have the opportunity to observe a successful group or watch inclusion happen in a particular classroom where it's very successful. And I think that is a huge leap for a lot of people, and they're much more comfortable with that. But there's also other opportunities, I think, when you're able to partner up, or your teachers are willing to partner up, a general ed teacher and a special ed teacher, and they actually co-teach, not all day necessarily, but part of the day, so they can interact with all students and understand how the learning happens for all students and see it in play. I think it's really important to have those models.
I totally agree. I just want to add that some students are just included in gen ed for, let's say, PE or lunch or recess. There's got to be planning for that as well. I can't say enough about planning. So just being out there 5 feet away from a gen ed student does not make you included in the activities. So somebody needs to work with the child. There's got to be some kind of an activity of, when you're out there, this is what you will do, go practice it, let's come back and talk about it. So there's a lot of planning that way, and there's a lot of planning from year to year. It gets really, really busy around springtime, and everybody's trying to do everything to end the year and begin the next year. There's got to be planning for what do we do, who is the best teacher, what should be in place day one for that student. And if they're changing from, let's say, elementary to middle school, planning around that, especially kids who suffer from autism, if they are able to go to the middle school, see it in action, have support people in place, know where they're going, so there should be some kind of a plan for those students.
That's great. Appreciate the answers. And we have a few more questions. So one is about from a district that conducted an informal study of their special education and general ed teachers in their local induction program. And we found that the perception of what inclusion looks like is very different. How do we define inclusion for others to understand better what it is and what it looks like? It's a really interesting question.
It is an interesting.
How do you bridge that gap between general and special education teachers on the induction side?
Mm-hmm. I do want to say a comment about induction that made me feel really comfortable to think that special ed and general ed teachers were working together in the induction program, because frequently I've seen them separate the induction programs. And what happens there, I think, is that instead of talking about really good instruction and learning, you're talking about the specifics of special education. And really and truly, it's about induction for quality teaching and effective teaching. So I think that's a starting place for sure. I don't know if anybody has anything else to add to that, but it is an issue. It's part of that separation issue.
And I think it's really important to also, as a district, really define what your high yield strategies are, because those will work for both gen ed and special ed. So I think, you know, involving in that preparation, if it hasn't happened, you know, in their certification, which we know in most cases it doesn't, when it gets to that induction program, specifically if the induction is done through this, the district level, you can start to build that cohesion of those strategies of which are, this is how we do business in this district because we know these are strategies that work. And then as they move forward past induction, really diving into those professional learning communities, and instead of having a separate one for first grade and second grade and a separate one then for the RSP teachers, you really should make sure that all of those communities of practice include both gen ed and special ed teachers. And that's how that conversation begins to be created, and the networking is more embraced.
I think it's learning the way of that particular district and everyone adopting the blank district way of teaching and learning. It really does make a difference if it's an effective strategy.
Great. Another great question. How does a small district manage co-teaching? We don't have enough special ed teachers to co-teach classes. 700 students, 2.5 special ed teachers. Any ideas?
Well, I want to share something that one of our principals did in Long Beach. He brought the gen ed and special ed kindergarten first, and I think we're going into second grade together. So it wasn't two special ed teachers collaborating, it was gen ed and special ed. And they were in on the trainings they went to, they made plans together, and it was tremendous. The change that they were able to make in the lives of those children was amazing. I told him he wanted to expand it, and I said, prove to me that you are also making a difference for gen ed students. So it shouldn't just be for special ed students. And they were able to show that general education students in the classes where gen ed and special ed worked together really did much better than the others that were not doing this program. So there is hope. I think it's just knowing what's out there and collaborating, putting brains together. The answers are there. We have a lot of good people in the districts we're working with. So they have the answers. It's just collaborating with gen ed and coming up with the answers that work for that specific district.
And I would just add, to reiterate, the importance of looking at ways to really be able to provide flexible instructional groups by grade span. So be it K2 or primary and upper, where that you can allow for those tier 1 and tier 2 supports and strategies to flow among and between grade levels based on student need versus their identification or their grade level.
And a tiered system of interventions.
Exactly.
If you have that in place and the departments talking to one another, planning together. So it's not just the teachers at the school site, but the departments have to start talking together. The fact that, and we have MTSS department and special ed isolated, working in different areas, just makes no sense. So putting all the chips in one pot, I think, would help.
Good idea.
All right, I think we're getting close to the conclusion of the webinar. There are a lot of questions, and I want to guarantee that we will answer. We've been trying to answer the questions that have been coming up, but we're also going to answer each of them individually. As noted before, we're going to provide a Q&A and the slides on our website. We'll also provide them to all of the participants. And there are different ways to get in touch with us. You have here our contact number. You also have Learn More at Pivot Learning. But you can also reach me at arun@pivotlearning.org. And if you reach out to me, or if you reach out to our Learn More, we will put you in touch with our fabulous special education team. Actually, it's our instructional improvement team, because it's far more than just special education. And of which Terry, Persima, and Connie are just a few of the wonderful folks that we have, but three of our most amazing leaders. So I want to thank you all for your participation in the webinar, and also for your interest in this topic, and for the interest of instructional improvement in special education, because typically that's not an area that's addressed directly. And we very much look forward to hearing from you in the future and finding ways to support you as you work on instructional improvement and academic improvement for kids with disabilities and all students in your schools and districts. Thank you.